Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the GCSE set text of The Sun. In this video we're going to be looking specifically at the set cover for examination in 2020. I am going to do a separate video for the set cover that starts being examined in 2021 onwards, and I'm also going to do a separate video about The Sun, industries and audiences for section B as well. You do need to understand that The Sun is a tabloid newspaper, and that means that it generally is seen as having softer news content, which means sort of slightly easier to understand news stories about slightly simpler or more popular things like entertainment, sports, celebrities. And that the reading age of The Sun's general audience is quite young. So, for example, I think the average reading age of The Sun's readers are about 8 years of age, which means that they might struggle to read more complex stories. So that might explain why the front cover of The Sun for examination in 2020 is a really large picture with a really small amount of writing. The larger image is going to engage that audience who perhaps want their news told to them in a really simplistic way, and the small amount of writing or the small amount of copy is what makes it perhaps easier for them to understand. The image is probably the first thing you notice on this newspaper cover. You have a map of Europe with the UK separated off from Europe by the graphic designs of the kind of tape or the cross. You need to understand what the newspaper article is about. So it's worth maybe doing a little bit of research into Brexit and the arguments that different people were putting across at the time about whether we should or shouldn't leave the EU. Now, The Sun is a right-wing paper. They are pro-conservative, anti-Labour, and they are often thought of as being quite xenophobic or having slightly more racist perspectives within their newspapers. And so their readers in general were mostly in favour of leaving the EU. And you can see this and their political stance and values, ideologies on their newspaper cover. This idea of separating the UK off using the design elements of the cross is quite an interesting way of making it clear that they think the UK should be separate from the rest of Europe. It's kind of interesting that they've only specifically labelled some countries on the European map. Perhaps The Sun's readers might not understand or know about or even care about the general geography of Europe, but they want to see the UK labelled because obviously that is where we live. And the fact that they have labelled just one or two other countries suggests that those perhaps are the countries The Sun and therefore its readers are potentially most worried about in terms of immigration. The wording of a headline which says draw a red line on immigration or else is quite important to be able to analyse and pick apart those words. So when we say draw a red line on something, it kind of means like if you imagine a teacher drawing a red line on work, it means like crossing it through, getting rid of it, saying that it's wrong. And so the connotations of that phrase are showing us that The Sun and therefore its readers are probably going to be anti-immigration and wanting it to stop. Use of the imperatives draw a red line on immigration is a good way of engaging that target audience and making it feel as though The Sun is kind of ordering us and the politicians it seems to be talking to do something, and that makes The Sun seem quite important and powerful. The use of direct address in the wording above the main headline where it says you tell him is again a good way of drawing in your audience. It makes it feel like you're talking directly to them. And so this media language is there to engage its readers and make it feel as though they are having a conversation specifically with the reader. As well as that, you get the warning or else. And that's the kind of thing, it's almost like a threat. So it's giving us this warning that if we don't stop immigration, The Sun is connoting or signifying to us that something bad is going to happen as a result. And the exclamation mark adds to that drama and the feeling of that this is a serious problem. The design of the red and white flag, as well as separating off the UK from the rest of Europe on the map, it also really resembles the St George's Cross, which is obviously the flag for England. And so that adds to this feeling that the Sun are patriotic. It adds to the feeling that this issue of immigration is about being patriotic and perhaps supporting England as a country. And it does connote patriotism, nationalism, and it makes the paper and its readers feel very, very British. It looks like there is a line of red tape running across the paper, and we often use this phrase red tape to mean bureaucracy. It means things that politicians or the government kind of make you do that you don't really want to do, but you have to. So we often talk about things like paperwork that you have to fill in as just being red tape. And so we often talk about red tape in terms of things that we have to do, but we don't really want to. And a lot of people felt this way about the EU. People felt, specifically the Sun readers, felt that the EU was making Britain do things that we didn't really want to do, that it was all bureaucracy, that it was forcing England and the people who lived here to live in a certain way and to follow certain rules that those readers did not want to follow. And they felt it was all red tape, and that what they wanted was for the politicians to cut that tape and allow England, in their view, to be free. The headline seems to be addressing the Prime Minister, who at the time was David Cameron. It's quite informal in its tone. The fact that it says, or else, suggests that they feel, as the newspaper, that they are more powerful than David Cameron and that they are warning him. So to warn someone like the Prime Minister about something suggests that the Sun feels as though they know more than him. As well as being quite disrespectful to David Cameron in the tone of the headline, they also kind of just refer to him as the PM in the words just above the headline. So they don't really even use his name, which perhaps shows another level of disrespect. And certainly the picture they've chosen in that bottom corner of the newspaper, the size and positioning of that picture right down in the corner suggests that he has been marginalised or made smaller. And that's potentially to show that they don't really respect him as a leader and that they see him as small and weak. The editors of The Sun will probably have specifically chosen this picture of David Cameron because not only does he look quite small in terms of the positioning, but his facial expression, he looks quite tired, he looks stressed, he looks a bit worried. He doesn't look like a very confident person. And so the deliberate choice to represent David Cameron as being somebody who is not in control, who is weak, and who is not confident about the way he's handling this situation is something The Sun will have chosen specifically for its political ideologies and its audience. The cover itself was created as a result of a poll that The Sun did and also a poll on the website YouGov. And what they did was they asked readers and they looked at the poll on YouGov about whether or not they wanted to leave the EU and whether or not they wanted immigration to be controlled more. And the poll found that 42%, and this is the YouGov poll, found that 42% of people did want more control over immigration. And The Sun has interpreted that as sort of suggesting that all of its readers want more control over immigration. And I suppose that's another thing you have to consider in that 42% is not a majority, but The Sun have interpreted the polls that way. So if you did get a question about how accurate the representations are within the newspaper, it's worth understanding about how they've chosen to interpret those statistics. So it's worth thinking about how real a newspaper coverage actually is. Is it really just truth and fact? Or have they used the media language like the photos and the headlines and the colours and the font to create specific ideas and bias about the issues and the people within the newspaper? The colours used on the front page, the white and red, do back up that idea of patriotism and Englishness that The Sun really wants to communicate for its readers. But it's quite interesting that the word immigration is in black. It makes it stand out, but more importantly, it has connotations of being kind of evil or bad in some way. And so the fact that the word immigration is in black, and it also seems quite a distressed font as well, like it's all mottled, that kind of makes it feel sort of dirty and almost blood splattered. So it's clearly connoting or signifying to the audience that immigration is inherently bad and dangerous, something to be scared of. In the small amount of copy on the left-hand side, it starts with the words, "The Sun says." Those words create this feeling that the Sun is important, that they are an important voice for the people, as though they speak for all of us in the country. And so it really connotes to us that they feel as though they are almost in charge and someone or a company that should be respected. The newspaper also uses quite emotive language in that small part of the article we can see. They use the word flood to describe immigration, as though we have to stop this flood. Now, a flood is a natural disaster. It can be something incredibly destructive. And so using this word flood to describe the number of immigrants coming into the country shows a clear bias and creates this idea of negativity associated with immigration. The masthead for the Sun in the top left-hand corner is always the same way in terms of the same font, colour, style, because it's very familiar branding and it creates this kind of brand identity for the newspaper. It's block capitals, which make the newspaper seem quite important and powerful. And think about the words "the Sun." The Sun is our life source as a planet. We depend upon it. We literally revolve around it, and it supplies our planet with life. So, using those words for the title of a newspaper creates the idea that the paper itself is central to our life system and that we should revolve around the newspaper itself. The strapline of the newspaper, Britain's most popular newspaper, obviously always is placed near the masthead at the top of the page, and that again adds to the representation of the paper being powerful and important and successful. In the top right-hand corner of the newspaper, you will see that there is an advert for Aldi supermarkets and displaying a sort of voucher offer for the readers. Now, that shows the target audience of the newspaper. For one, it suggests that they're perhaps lower earners because Aldi is thought of as kind of a budget supermarket. But the voucher being displayed on the front would engage the readers and make them think they're getting value for money as well. In the bottom right-hand corner, they have some text that says special report, and then it asks you to read on a certain page. And then in the actual small portion of the article that we get on the left-hand side, at the bottom it says continued on, and then it tells you what page to turn to. These act as Enigma codes for the audience because we realise we haven't read the full article. We realise we haven't seen everything or read everything that there is to read. And so those Enigma codes help us to be encouraged to turn over and read the rest of the newspaper. Representations of immigration and immigrants on this newspaper cover seem to reflect a growing trend in the British media for representing immigrants in quite a stereotypical negative fashion. There's been a continued rise in the amount of nationalism, and nationalism to the extent of being quite Islamophobic, xenophobic. And so this newspaper is quite reflective of the context of our country, our cultural context, and what is going on, and a kind of shift in viewpoints for some people within the country. It's worth realising that the issue of immigration in Britain is actually incredibly complex and depends on a whole range of factors. It's not a simple issue at all, and yet The Sun have used their cover to make it look incredibly simple. They've simplified the issue for their readers to make it, A, really easy to understand, but also to make it feel like there is no choice and that this is what has to be done. Cutting the UK off from the rest of Europe is something that is simple and must happen. And so it's worth understanding that they have simplified that issue. It's not as simple as that. But they've done that perhaps because their readers need it to be done in simple terms. So with this cover, if you get a media language question, like I said, it will be broken down into parts where you may have to analyse the positioning or the layout or the colours, the graphic design work with the kind of flag and the strips of tape, the headlines, the wording, the image of David Cameron. So being able to pick those apart and talking about what they might signify or how they mean things to the audience, why they appeal to that audience is important. If this newspaper cover comes up in a representation question, you need to remember that it will always be a longer question worth more marks, and it will always be in comparison to an unseen newspaper cover that you will get in the exam. So you need to get used to comparing perhaps this newspaper with other newspaper covers and being able to see similarities and differences between the way they might represent people like David Cameron, the way they might represent issues or events like immigration or Brexit, the EU, and being able to compare and contrast, and more importantly as well, explain why those newspapers might have represented things either similarly or differently.